So why would you recommend using technology for managing desk booking, say, over a manual process?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question because we've seen quite a few organizations who have initially taken a run at doing this manually in the previous lockdowns and then returning to the office. And actually, I suppose at a very small level, manually may be okay. If you know you're only going to allow a very small number of a very large office to come in, perhaps in the very early phase, you could do something manual. But I think that there are a couple of things to consider. I think, first of all, this is not just about saving money. And of course, the manual process behind doing this is typically done with saving money in mind. There's an enormous risk to getting it wrong. And it is easy to get it wrong if you do it manually, because people are more fallible than computers tend to be. So in other words, it's easy to pressurize somebody. Perhaps if their job is to manually book desks, then it's easy for someone persuasive to perhaps pressurize them to sit in their favorite desk, or to move somebody out of their position that they like to sit in just because they want access to it. It's easy for them to try and break the rules, in the sense that you might decide as a business that you don't want people to book a rolling weekly slot because they may not always turn up to it because of any range of different things that could happen, precluding them from getting to the office. So if someone starts to say, well, look, it's fine, I won't make that mistake, it was different with me. It's easy for a human to kind of go, okay, well, I trust you, or feel pressurized to say that I trust you, even maybe when they don't. A computer can't behave that way. Additionally, if you think about all of those sorts of things that could happen, and then people not turning up, and then perhaps record keeping not being quite as it should be because humans are fallible in this sense, then it becomes a much bigger job than you may have originally thought. So if you're trying to book 2 or 3 desks, then okay, that's possible to do manually, albeit it's probably a lot more work than one might really think it would be. When you start to talk about 20, 30 desks, that becomes very difficult. If you're talking about 20 or 30 people, it's almost impossible. And so when we've seen that happen, and I spoke to a guy who was an IT manager in a large end user who'd been tasked with this, his response was, because he'd started to look at technology, was that, this is what I do full time now. I just book desks for people.
Gosh.
So not only was he, spending a lot of time doing a job he really didn't want to do, he then actually wasn't doing the things that he was supposed to be doing. And I have no idea how much he was paid, but as an IT manager, I'd imagine it was a reasonable amount. So his whole salary was going on desk booking. So back to this idea of it's somehow cheaper to do this manually, I would say that it definitely isn't. If you compare that to the cost of doing something in an automated way that doesn't have any of those points of failure that I talked about earlier, is much less socially awkward as well, then it doesn't compare. It's just lower cost to not do it manually. That's the very simple reason. The other reason I would say is there is an enormous risk to getting it wrong. If somebody is responsible for the fact that there is a transmission of coronavirus or something similar around the office to make a lot of people ill or worse, then who is responsible for that? The company, the person that was supposed to book this stuff appropriately, or the person that turned up when perhaps they shouldn't have done because they pressurized someone into getting them a desk? These are not risks you want to take. Not only that, but if it comes to track and trace, you need to be sure that your data is correct, because if you want to know who was in the office on the day that somebody came in and was ill, heaven forbid, then it is much better to have an automated system than it would be to have something manual and relying on those notes. And that's before you've even started to think about the fact that those people who are tasked with this have to have time off sometimes because they may not be very well themselves. It's not really a comparison.